There's two ways you can try and resolve that tension. Number one, change the belief. Number two, or reinterpret the evidence. Changing the belief would require him to say internally, I am not as accurate as I thought. That feels like shrinkage. Reinterpreting the evidence feels safer. He can question the data, question the timing, question the assumptions, and immediately tension reduces. This is the crucial point. Rejecting dissonance gives instant relief. Updating belief gives slow growth. The ego prefers the faster relief. If your identity is tied to being principled, righteous, disciplined, then witnessing someone else's moral failure becomes ego fuel for you. You feel affirmed, validated, and elevated in your own sort of mind without others confirming that or affirming it. You are projecting yourself as a superior person. But if you examine carefully, that elevation is not only artificial, it's also very fragile because your self-worth depends on someone else's flaws. Imagine in a social setting or a family setting, you say something and then somebody just points out that what you said is wrong and they made you feel wrong. How does that make you feel? I've certainly been through this, no doubt you have as well, that being wrong feels humiliating to you. It is not because you care deeply about the truth. It is because your identity is entangled with your beliefs. That sentence alone will disturb many people. Because most of us like to believe that when we argue, when we defend, when we push back, we are doing so out of principle. But pause and examine for a moment. What actually happens when someone corrects you in public and tells you that you are wrong? Not philosophically, physically. You start feeling that irritation, agitation inside of you. Your thoughts start to accelerate. And even when the other person is speaking, you're not really listening to them. You're too busy formulating a response in your own mind as to how you're going to counter that. Before you evaluate whether the correction is valid, your body is already preparing the defense. That reaction is not about information, it is about exposure. Because somewhere in your life, being right stopped being something you value and started being something you are. You were not born this way, you were shaped this way. And things like this can be traced back to childhood. When you answered correctly in school, what happened? You were praised, affirmed, elevated. And when you were wrong, you were corrected, sometimes laughed at, embarrassed. And obviously it creates that comparison with others. Slowly, almost invisibly, a connection formed. When you're correct, you feel safe. When you're incorrect, you feel exposed. Now let's add another layer. You're so clever. You always see things clearly. This is other people saying these things to you, or your own mind whispering to you that you're the sensible one. You're the logical one. Those compliments feel harmless, encouraging even, but they do something subtle. And what is it that they do? They attach the identity to correctness. Instead of intelligence being a tool you use, it becomes a trait you must protect at all costs. And once intelligence becomes part of who you are, being wrong feels like identity damage. This conditioning doesn't disappear in adulthood. It actually matures and grows and solidifies. You grow into your professional life, your social life, your intellectual life. You develop positions, opinions, frameworks, and gradually, without noticing, these positions become woven into how you see yourself. They are not just something that you believe in terms of, let's say, whether it's politics or anything to do with any aspect of religion, spirituality, morality. You begin to believe this as an intrinsic part of your identity. You are a rational thinker. You are not just someone who holds religious views, you are principled. And this makes it ensure for you that you're not just someone who makes business decisions, you are decisive. Now imagine someone challenges one of those positions publicly. You say something confidently in a meeting, someone responds confidently and calmly, I don't think that's accurate. Nothing aggressive, no raised voice, just a disagreement, and something inside you shifts immediately. When someone corrects you, your body reacts before your mind does. Your chest tightens, your posture changes, your thoughts start assembling a counter argument. And that reaction isn't about the truth, it's about identity. Because if your belief is tied to who you are, correction feels like an attack. And it's at that moment where being wrong feels like a humiliation, and you no longer are defending an identity. You are defending yourself. You are defending your identity. That's why, as I mentioned before, when someone corrects you in public, rather than accepting that, you are automatically formulating a defense, a response. You're not really listening to what the other person is saying. You are too busy trying to see how you're going to counter attack what they have just said. So most people never pause long enough to notice that shift. They think they are arguing logically, but internally they are restoring psychological ground, because losing an argument does not feel like adjusting information. It feels like shrinking, and shrinking feels dangerous for many people. Now let me show you how this becomes structural. There was a man I once observed closely in a professional environment. He had built a company from nothing. Years of relentless effort, sacrifice, risk had allowed him to build this very successful company. He'd been right more times than he had been wrong. And that track record became part of his story, his identity. And over time, that story becomes part of that person's identity and character, as I've said. Like, is repeating constantly, I've built this, I understand this, I see what others don't. In the early years, that confidence was earned. He had sharper instincts than those around him. He had endured pressure others had not. Obviously, he was in the front line, in the trenches, building this company. But success also has a hidden cost. It reinforces certainty. And certainty, when repeated constantly, becomes entitlement. Meetings begin to change subtly. Fewer objections, more agreement, more people are just nodding to what you say. Not because people are incapable of thinking critically, but because they had learned something quietly, that correction in this instance may feel uncomfortable. Now imagine a turning point. The industry shifts. Just because this person's knowledge was impeccable at the beginning, but over the time things have changed. The dynamics of the work that they are involved in has changed. Markets change, and younger executives in the company begin noticing trends that the founder does not notice or has a blind spot. One of them presents data respectfully, calmly. There is no rebellion, no emotional tone, just evidence that which may be like a contradiction to what the founder believes in. In that moment, the founder feels something inside of them shift in terms of they feel uncomfortable. If he accepts this correction, what happens to the identity he has carried for years? The decisive architect, the clear-sighted builder, the man who sees further than others, who is more often correct than not. Admitting error here would not simply update strategy, it would revise self-image. So instead of revising, he reframes. He emphasizes long-term perspective. He questions whether the data set is complete. He reminds the room of his past successes. And once again, he wins the room at that moment in time, but something changes. Silence grows, not because he is always right, but because correction feels costly. And that's how the people around him stop giving ideas, stop criticizing, or stop challenging his view. And he is not stupid, he's not malicious, he's just attached to that identity. His belief in his own clarity has become fused with that identity. And once that fusion happens, revision of any sort or challenge of any sort feels like erosion. You see this pattern everywhere in human behavior once you recognize it, in politics, in religion, in academia, in marriage even. The moment the person's belief fuses with the identity, the truth becomes threatening. And when truth becomes threatening, the growth actually slows or even stops, because growth requires that destabilization. It requires the person to question their beliefs, which may have formed over many years and decades. And that destabilization feels like danger. This is only the beginning of the problem. Because once identity and belief merge, cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. Let's go back to that boardroom, the scenario in the boardroom with that executive. What happened there was not stupidity, it was cognitive dissonance. Your brain is wired for coherence. So when new information is presented to you, or your belief system is being attacked, where you now have to behave which is inconsistent with the way you have been behaving or projecting yourself, that is when the brain becomes uncomfortable with what is being presented, because you need your internal story about yourself to feel consistent. With new information which contradicts that story, tension arises. That's cognitive dissonance. Not mild tension, but physiological tension. You feel agitation, a subtle spike in alertness, an internal pressure that demands resolution. That discomfort, again, is cognitive dissonance. It's not just philosophical disagreement, it is identity strain. When the founder heard the younger executive's data, two beliefs collided. So these two realities cannot comfortably coexist with each other. There's obviously a way of dealing with this. Something has to give. There's two ways you can try and resolve that tension. Number one, change the belief. Number two, or reinterpret the evidence. Changing the belief would require him to say internally, I am not as accurate as I thought. That feels like shrinkage. Reinterpreting the evidence feels safer. He can question the data, question the timing, question the assumptions, and immediately tension reduces. This is the crucial point. Rejecting dissonance gives instant relief. Updating belief gives slow growth. The ego prefers the faster relief. Now understand something dangerous here. Intelligence does not protect you from this, it amplifies it. Because the more articulate you are, the better you become at rationalizing. You can construct elegant defenses, you can use complex language, nuanced distinctions, technical reframing. And while believing you are being objective, but beneath the surface, identity is being protected. This is why highly intelligent individuals can become the most rigid. They are not incapable of seeing flaws, they are just unwilling to detach from that reality that they've built over the years, the identity which is now flawed, but they want to keep projecting that same identity irrespective of the flaws, because they do not want to shatter the image that they have created for people around them. And now let's move to another example where, from a leadership to collective tribe mentality mindsets, where beliefs are rarely isolated, they cluster together socially. Political belief connects to moral belief connects to identity, identity connects to belonging. Once belonging enters the equation, again, a challenge or a revision of that particular belief becomes even more dangerous. So if I soften my position, do I lose standing in my group, all these people around me who have accepted me in their circle? If I admit uncertainty, do I weaken collective identity? The tribe strengthens that attachment, that identity, because now you are not just defending a belief, you are defending your position, which is belonging to that particular tribe. You are you do not want anything to challenge your belonging to a particular group of people, whether it's a tribe or a political party. And belonging to something is so deep rooted into people's beliefs, into their own comforts. It's old as time. Belonging historically to certain tribes, groups, it almost means survival for some people. So when people challenge a belief tied to a particular tribe or a community, your nervous system reacts as if something deeper is at risk. This is why debates escalate so quickly. They're not about ideas, they are about identity, stability within a group. Notice how language changes in tribal spaces. Nuance disappears, certainty sharpens, complexity is flattened. Why? Because simplicity stabilizes identity. Complexity destabilizes it. And it's that destabilization which feels like danger. That's why you will notice that when two opposing parties are arguing or debating to protect their own beliefs, even let's say in a religious debate, let's give an example. You may have a Christian scholar or a Christian person debating with, let's say, somebody defending the Islamic religion. Both of them will argue, give examples, quote their texts, but very rarely do either of them shift to the other side or able to convince the other about their beliefs being wrong. Both get entrenched into their beliefs even more because the purpose is to protect their identity more than anything else. So this is why you see when people are debating with each other, nobody really wins the argument. They both walk away thinking that they've won the argument. Because it's this certainty. Certainty feels powerful because it removes ambiguity. Because ambiguity is where the growth lives. If you can't tolerate ambiguity, you will cling to certainty, even when it's incomplete. That's why in religious debates, even if one or the other sounds ridiculous in what they are claiming, they very rarely shift their ground to encompass the new thing that has been presented to them. They are just stamping the ground, digging their heels to just continue perpetuating their own beliefs to try and impose them on the other person. Now let's look at this through the lens of a personal situation where in a relationship, through the prism of marriage. You have a husband who prides himself on being a rational person. He thinks he's calm, logical, unemotional. His identity rests on being the stable one. And let's say he gets into an argument with his wife, and his wife says, "You never really listen." He immediately feels defensive because if that statement is true, it contradicts his identity. He doesn't see himself as dismissive. He sees himself as reasonable. So instead of examining the possibility that she may be right, he actually corrects her. He explains to her why she is overreacting, why she has misunderstood, why his tone was neutral. He wins the logic, he wins the argument, but he obviously loses something else in the process, that connection. This is a very common example throughout the world in marital situations because we are more focused on winning the argument. We are more focused on, at that moment in time, in defending our identity, because what it was needed in that moment was not defense, it was humility. And humility requires security. If your identity is so fragile, humility feels like surrender. So imagine this pattern repeating for years. Small corrections rejected, small vulnerabilities deflected. Over time, that emotional intimacy erodes in that relationship. Not because there was hatred, but because identity attachment blocked that growth. It stopped that criticism from being used as a constructive criticism for growth. The ego stepped in to choose preservation over transformation. Unless you intervene consciously. Now, let's look at a different scenario. Let's move into superiority, the superior ego. Superiority is the ego's favorite stabilizer. When you feel uncertain, lowering someone else restores height. You see someone behaving foolishly, you feel a quiet satisfaction, and at least I'm not like that. That sentence seems harmless, but it reveals something more structural, deep-seated belief rooted in, which is sort of unchangeable. Your worth is being measured comparatively, and comparison is something that which many of us find very unstable. The moment you feel taller because someone else looks smaller, because you've weighed them up and you've thought in your own mind that they are beneath you, that is not confidence. That is compensation. You are, in your own mind, justifying your superior ego, because that superiority gives you a quick sense of solidity, of false confidence and reassurance. But that's what it is. It's artificial, because it depends on someone else remaining below you. True anchoring does not require comparison. It does not need someone beneath it. This is where moral superiority becomes dangerous. If your identity is tied to being principled, righteous, disciplined, then witnessing someone else's moral failure becomes ego fuel for you. You feel affirmed, validated, and elevated in your own sort of mind without others confirming that or affirming it. You are projecting yourself as a superior person. But if you examine carefully, that elevation is not only artificial, it's also very fragile, because your self-worth depends on someone else's flaws. And your self-worth is conditional. Conditional worth must constantly be defended. Now ask yourself honestly, where do you react most aggressively? Where do you feel most compelled to correct others? Where does disagreement irritate you the fastest? This is where identity is most fused, and that is where growth will feel most threatening, because growth requires destabilization, and destabilization threatens that very ego structure that you have created over years, maybe decades. So if you feel strong when you are certain, then your strength is fragile. Real strength is being calm under correction. You're able to take criticism from others. You don't leap out just to defend yourself, irrespective of whether what they are mentioning is truthful or not. Maybe you know yourself that what you've said is wrong and subject to many flaws, but you're more keen to protect your identity. Now let's move towards another deeper layer, because all of this leadership, rigidity, tribal mindset, superior ego points to something fundamental. You are not afraid of being wrong. What you are afraid of being is looking diminished in the sight of others. And those are not the same thing, because being wrong is informational. Being diminished feels existential. So the ego defends not the ideas, but stature. And once stature becomes primary, truth becomes secondary. This is where intellectual stagnation begins. And this is where we now turn to. If stature becomes more important than truth, something inside you begins to harden. Not visibly at first. You will speak intelligently, you still appear composed, you still argue very well, but something shifts beneath the surface. Curiosity shrinks. You begin listening less to understand and more to prepare. So as I've mentioned, we've all done this, myself included. Sometimes when people are talking to us, we are not listening to them. We're too busy forming our own response in our mind and preparing what we are going to say, because we think What I have to say is more important and needs to challenge what this person is saying, or let me put them in their place, or let me correct them. As long as they don't correct me, let me correct them. You scan conversations for threats rather than insights. You protect conclusions instead of refining them. And over time, this becomes your character, because identity attachment does not just affect arguments, it shapes who you become. Let's just analyze this further. Imagine a public intellectual whose entire platform is built on a particular worldview. They may have books published, lectures delivered, followers who have gathered around them. It could be a scholar, it could be a political figure or a pundit. That worldview is just not an identity anymore. It is a reputation, it's a livelihood, it's a brand. And now imagine new evidence emerges that complicates that worldview. Not destroys it, but challenges its completeness. If this person updates publicly, what happens? They look at being seen as inconsistent. They risk losing their reputation. They actually risk undermining their whole brand. And whatever they've stood for, they basically can end up losing that. They risk disappointing their audience, their followers. So what do? They hesitate. Then they will reinterpret that evidence. They question the source. They subtly shift the narrative without acknowledging that they could be wrong or that a revision is required of them, their worldview. Outwardly, nothing dramatic happens, but internally, a decision has been made where an image needs to be protected over growth. And that decision, repeated over years, produces that rigid character mindset. Not because a person lacked intelligence, it's because they lacked detachment from identity. Understand that for a moment, because this is not just about public figures, this is about you and me. In our own life, how many times have we felt the urge to defend something simply because we had previously said it confidently? Not because we were not because it was the truth. It's because we were certain. We were certain that this was correct at that moment in time. Now, retracting it would feel embarrassing. That is ego. That is your ego in operation. It may not be loud and arrogant, but it's the quiet ego in operation. The kind that protects the image in many subtle ways. One ancient wise person spoke about strengthening the self against the ego and ensuring that we are not inflating the ego. There is a crucial difference here, that ego strength is brittle. It requires constant validation, whereas it needs to be right. Whereas the self, like strengthening the self, is different. It is anchored. It doesn't panic when it is corrected. It does not collapse when it's exposed. It can revise without humiliation, because its worth is not sort of based on opinion. When your identity is anchored beneath your beliefs rather than fused with them, then being corrected in public does no longer feel like a threat. It's something you take on board. It requires separating who you are from what you think. And most people never do this because detachment feels destabilizing. And you ask yourself, oh, if I'm not who I have said all this time as to what I stand for, then who am I? That question feels very uncomfortable, because over the years or even decades, we have built our identity through that narrative, which may even be a false narrative that which we know that it is now. We tell ourselves, this is who we are, this is the image we have built, this is me. And any challenge to these sort of narratives is extremely uncomfortable for us. But we need to understand that if we are to grow, then the ego needs to be challenged. The ego defends the story you tell yourself. The self expands when the story is incomplete. So imagine 20 years from now, you have spent decades defending your positions. You've won arguments. You've protected the self-image. you have maintained this consistency. Maybe you were respected, but internally something did not feel right. You really paused to examine yourself. You feel irritated now that you've clung on to some old beliefs which may not have been correct or which may no longer be valid. This is the truth that you have to sort of live with in years to come. If you remain that rigid person of character, mindset, who does not willing to change with time, with new evidence, with a curious mind.